Late one evening, Emma was running late from her shift at the hospital. It was nearly midnight, and she had one errand left: a quick stop at a local pharmacy to pick up a prescription. She pulled into the empty parking lot, the pharmacy's neon sign flickering like a pulse in the darkness. The place had always given her an eerie feeling, but this was the only 24-hour pharmacy nearby. As she approached the sliding glass doors, they opened with a slow hiss, almost reluctant. Inside, the pharmacy was dimly lit, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. Emma noticed the lack of customers, though it made sense at this hour. The aisles stretched out in eerie silence, the shelves stacked with rows of cold medicine, cough syrup, and all sorts of remedies. She walked up to the pharmacy counter, tapping the small bell. The sound echoed unnaturally in the stillness. No one came. Emma tapped it again, this time with more force. Again. No response. She leaned over the counter to peer into the back area. It was shadowy, and she could see the shelves lined with medication bottles, but no sign of a pharmacist or employee. Uneasy, she stepped back and scanned the store again. It was too quiet, as if the store itself was holding its breath. Something felt off. She was about to leave when she heard a soft, shuffling sound coming from one of the aisles. Emma turned her head sharply, her heart skipping a beat. From the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow sliding across the floor, disappearing around a corner. She wasn't alone. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no reply. She debated leaving right then and there, but the prescription was important. She decided to follow the sound, walking cautiously down the aisle. As she turned the corner, she was greeted by empty shelves. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows. The pharmacy felt colder than before, as if a draft had blown through, but there were no open doors or windows. Emma's mind raced. She had definitely seen something move, but now there was nothing. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the silence. She pulled it out to see a text from her friend Sarah, but when she unlocked the screen, the message wasn't from Sarah at all. Instead, it was an unsaved number with a single chilling sentence: "Don't turn around." Emma froze, her blood turning to ice, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, every hair on the back of her neck began to rise, the primal instinct of being watched overwhelming her. She could feel it, the weight of someone standing behind her. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The lights flickered again. Emma tightened her grip on her phone, her pulse hammering in her ears. She forced herself to breathe and, despite the warning, turned around. Nothing. There was no one there. But as her eyes scanned the aisle, she noticed something that hadn't been there before. A small prescription bottle sitting on the floor. Its label was worn and unreadable, but it was clear it had been placed deliberately. She stared at it, feeling her skin crawl. The pharmacy was supposed to be empty, but someone had been here, someone who was watching her. Emma bent down, cautiously picking up the bottle. As she turned it in her hand, the lights in the entire pharmacy suddenly went out, plunging her into total darkness. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she dropped the bottle, hearing it roll across the floor with a clattering sound that echoed through the silence. The emergency lights flickered on a moment later, casting a dim, red glow across the aisles. Emma's hands shook as she reached for her phone, trying to call for help. But the screen was blank. No signal, no bars, nothing. She was cut off. A sound broke the silence, a slow creak followed by the unmistakable whisper of footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, and getting closer. Emma's heart pounded violently in her chest as she looked around, desperate for an exit. She could hear the footsteps now, slow and steady, drawing nearer. Then, from behind the pharmacy counter, a figure emerged. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was dressed in a pharmacist's coat, but his face was obscured by a mask. His eyes, barely visible through small slits, were hollow, empty, as if there was nothing human left behind them. In his hand, he held a syringe, the needle glinting under the red emergency lights. Emma's body locked in terror. She stumbled backward, her mind racing for an escape. The figure stepped forward, his movements methodical, unhurried, as if he knew there was no way out for her. "Your prescription is ready," the man's voice rasped, low and guttural, the words dripping with malice. Emma turned and ran, her feet barely making contact with the ground as she bolted down the aisles. Her heart raced faster than her legs, and her breathing was shallow. panicked. She made it to the entrance, but the automatic doors didn't budge. She slammed her hands against the glass, desperation clawing at her throat. Behind her, the footsteps were steady, echoing louder with every second. She spun around, her eyes wild, searching for another way out. There, just beyond the aisles, she saw a small exit sign glowing faintly in the back of the store. She sprinted toward it, not daring to look back. The door was heavy, but she shoved it open and stumbled out into the night air. Emma didn't stop running until she reached her car. With trembling hands, she fumbled for her keys and jumped inside, locking the doors. She glanced in her rearview mirror, expecting to see the masked figure standing in the pharmacy doorway, but there was no one. The parking lot was empty, as if nothing had ever happened. She didn't dare go back to the pharmacy. The next morning, when Emma tried to tell her story to the police, they were skeptical. They questioned her about the pharmacy, asking for details about the man she saw. Emma insisted on what happened, but when they followed up, they found something she couldn't have anticipated. The pharmacy had been closed for 3 years. It had been shut down after a series of unsolved disappearances, including the pharmacist who used to run it. The building had been left abandoned, though its lights still flickered on occasionally. A glitch in the system. No one was supposed to be inside. As Emma sat in stunned silence, the police officer handed her a small prescription bottle they'd found near the counter when they investigated. Her name was printed neatly on the label. The prescription date was for the previous night. It was a cold, rainy night when Jessica found herself in need of some last-minute medicine. Her toddler had come down with a fever, and with the local stores closed for the night, she had no choice but to visit the old pharmacy on the outskirts of town. Everyone in the area knew about it, a strange place that stood like a relic from decades past. The staff was minimal, and the building was as dilapidated as it was eerie. People whispered that strange things had happened there over the years, but no one ever talked in detail. Pulling up to the pharmacy, the windows were dimly lit, casting weak, yellow light onto the wet pavement. The neon sign flickered erratically, casting a ghostly glow on the store's faded exterior. Jessica hesitated for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. The rain pounded against her windshield, blurring the building, making it seem less real. She didn't want to go inside, but her child needed the medicine. Inside, the bell above the door jingled faintly as she entered. The atmosphere was thick, the air almost musty. There was a strange smell, like dampness mixed with the faint odor of chemicals. The place was unnervingly empty, with only the sound of the rain outside and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. She approached the counter, where an older man in a white coat stood, his back to her as he organized a shelf. He hadn't acknowledged her presence yet, which felt odd. She cleared her throat, causing him to turn slowly. "Can I help you?" His voice was low, almost mechanical, as if it took effort to speak. "Yeah, my son is sick. I need something for his fever," Jessica said, glancing nervously at the shelves behind him. For some reason, she felt the urge to leave quickly, like her gut was warning her. The man's expression remained blank, his eyes strangely hollow as he nodded and slowly turned to grab a bottle. As he placed it on the counter, Jessica reached into her bag to find her wallet. But as she pulled it out, something caught her eye. Behind the counter, in the shadows of the back room, there was movement. A figure, small, hunched over, darted across the narrow doorway. She blinked, certain her tired eyes were playing tricks on her. "Is someone else here?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. The old man looked at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. "No one that concerns you," he said flatly. His words sent a chill down her spine, but before she could question him further, the sound came. It was a faint scratching noise, like nails against wood or metal. It grew louder, coming from the back room. Jessica's heart began to pound in her chest. Something about the sound was wrong, unnatural. She stared at the old man, waiting for him to react, but he remained emotionless, as if he hadn't heard it at all. "Is everything okay back there?" she asked, her voice shaking now. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, walking into the back room without a word, leaving her alone at the counter. Jessica's instincts screamed for her to leave, but something held her in place. She leaned over the counter, trying to see into the back. The scratching sound had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whispering that sent shivers through her body. Suddenly, the lights flickered. For a brief moment, the entire store plunged into darkness, and in that split second, Jessica thought she saw something in the far corner of the room. Something crouched, with long, twisted limbs and gleaming eyes reflecting the weak light. The lights snapped back on, and the figure was gone. But the fear that gripped her chest was very real. She backed away from the counter, her heart racing, eyes scanning the store. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, coming from behind her. But the entrance was empty. The door still closed. The door still closed. Her pulse quickened. The footsteps stopped, but the silence was worse. She could feel it. Someone or something was watching her. Without thinking, Jessica turned and ran toward the door, her shoes slipping on the wet floor as she grabbed the handle and yanked. The door wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, panic rising, but it was stuck, sealed shut as if it had never been opened at all. The air seemed to thicken around her, oppressive and suffocating. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she pounded on the glass. Then, from behind her, she heard the old man's voice, soft but clear. "You shouldn't have come here." Her blood froze. Slowly, she turned her head to see him standing in the middle of the store, his eyes gleaming in the dim light, a twisted smile spreading across his face. And he wasn't alone. From the shadows behind him, the figure she had glimpsed earlier emerged, a creature hunched and grotesque, its limbs too long, its eyes glowing with malevolence. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like a puppet on strings. Jessica's stomach dropped as the creature stepped closer, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. Her hands trembled violently as she tried to open the door again, but her fingers were slick with sweat, unable to find any grip. "Please," she whispered, not knowing whether she was begging the man or the thing lurking behind him. The creature moved faster now, its long arms reaching toward her with terrifying ease. The old man just watched, his smile growing wider, his eyes now as dead and hollow as the rest of the store. She screamed, throwing herself against the door one last time. The door gave way. She stumbled out into the rain, her chest heaving, her body shaking uncontrollably. Behind her, the pharmacy stood in eerie silence, the neon signs still flickering. The door closed softly behind her, the jingle of the bell the only sound cutting through the rain. Jessica didn't look back as she scrambled to her car, the primal need to escape overwhelming everything else. When she finally started the engine, her hands still trembling, she glanced back at the building one last time. The lights inside were off now, and the pharmacy stood as still as death itself. But just before she sped away, she saw it. Standing in the window, the old man watched her, his eyes gleaming in the darkness, and next to him, barely visible but unmistakable, the creature stood, grinning widely as if it was waiting for her to return. And as the rain poured down, Jessica knew she would never come back, but deep down, she feared that one day, it might come for her. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Mark realized he was out of his anxiety medication. His doctor had just changed his prescription, and with a long week ahead, he didn't want to risk missing a dose. There was only one pharmacy nearby that stayed open late, a small, old-fashioned place nestled between vacant buildings. It wasn't the most inviting spot, but it was his only option. The night was cold as he pulled up in front of the pharmacy. The flickering fluorescent sign barely lit the entrance. The place had been there for years, unchanged, almost as though time forgot it. Mark pushed through the heavy glass door, a small bell jingling overhead. Inside, the pharmacy felt unnervingly still. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a harsh, unnatural glow over the shelves. A musty odor hung in the air, mixing with the sterile smell of rubbing alcohol. Mark glanced around, expecting to see the pharmacist, but no one was there. The store felt empty, as if it had been abandoned mid-shift. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing faintly. There was no response, just the eerie hum of the lights. Mark approached the counter, tapping the bell. The sound seemed to linger in the air longer than it should have. He tapped it again. Still nothing. As he stood there, waiting, a soft rustling sound came from one of the aisles. Mark turned his head sharply, peering down the rows of medication, but saw no one. His heart began to beat a little faster, the unease creeping up his spine. He walked over to the aisle where the noise had come from, but as he stepped into it, he found nothing unusual. Just rows of pills, syrups, and ointments. But the air felt heavier now, almost oppressive. "Is anyone here?" he called out again, a little louder this time. There was a long silence. Then, from the back of the store came the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. Mark froze, listening as slow, deliberate footsteps echoed toward him. He turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows behind the pharmacy counter. It was the pharmacist, a middle-aged man with thin, graying hair and an emotionless expression. But something about him was off. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, they were blank, as if he was staring right through Mark. "Sorry for the wait," the pharmacist said, his voice flat and mechanical. "What can I help you with?" Mark forced a smile, trying to shake off the growing dread that was clawing at him. "I'm here to pick up a prescription," he said, stepping toward the counter. "For Mark Winters." The pharmacist nodded slowly and turned his back to retrieve the medication. Mark watched him move stiffly, almost robotically, his movements too precise, too rehearsed. The whole situation felt wrong. As the pharmacist shuffled through the shelves, Mark glanced around the store again. That's when he noticed it. Just beyond the counter, in the corner of the pharmacy, was an old, dirty mirror. And in the reflection, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The pharmacist wasn't alone. There, standing in the shadows just out of sight, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed far too long for its body. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and though its face was hidden in shadow, Mark could feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. His stomach twisted in fear, but when he looked back at the pharmacist, there was no sign of the figure. The corner was empty. The reflection in the mirror was gone. "Here you are," the pharmacist said, placing the prescription bottle on the counter. His voice startled Mark out of his daze. "Take 1 tablet every night before bed." Mark swallowed hard and nodded, grabbing the bottle with shaky hands. "Thanks," he muttered, eager to get out of there. As he turned to leave, the pharmacist spoke again, his voice even lower now. "Be careful out there. The night isn't always what it seems." Mark paused, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He didn't look back as he hurried out of the store, his heart racing. Outside, the cold air hit him like a slap, but it didn't ease the unease gnawing at his insides. He jumped into his car, glancing back at the pharmacy. The lights inside were dimmer now, and through the glass door, he could just make out the pharmacist standing perfectly still behind the counter, watching him. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw something else. There, just behind the pharmacist, was the figure from the mirror. Its face was still obscured, but its long, spindly limbs were now visible, draped in the shadows like a predator waiting to strike. The thing didn't move, but Mark felt its presence, hungry, watching, as if it was sizing him up. His heart pounded in his chest as he floored the gas, speeding out of the parking lot. He drove home as fast as he could. The image of that creature burned into his mind. When he got home, he rushed inside, locking the doors behind him. He tossed the prescription bottle onto the kitchen counter, his hands still trembling. He didn't care about the medication anymore. All he wanted was to forget what he had seen. But as he sat on the edge of his bed, trying to calm himself down, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. His breath hitched as he hesitated before answering. "Hello?" he said, his voice shaky. There was no sound on the other end, just heavy breathing, followed by a low, rasping whisper that sent a chill down his spine. "You shouldn't have left." Mark's heart nearly stopped. He dropped the phone, his hands trembling uncontrollably. His mind raced. He scrambled to his feet, his pulse roaring in his ears. That's when he heard it. From just outside his bedroom window came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably close. Mark turned to the window, his breath caught in his throat. The shadow outside his window was tall, too tall, and it was waiting. It was late autumn, and the air had grown cold and crisp when Lisa decided to stop by a small pharmacy on the outskirts of town. She had recently moved into the area and didn't know much about the neighborhood yet. The pharmacy was old, with peeling paint and an outdated sign hanging above the door. But it was late, and she needed to pick up some cold medicine for her nagging cough, so she didn't think much of it. The place seemed deserted as she walked in, the bell above the door tinkling softly. Inside, the pharmacy was dimly lit. The rows of shelves cast long shadows that stretched across the floor, and the faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air. It was quiet, unnervingly so. Lisa approached the counter, expecting to see someone, but the area behind the register was empty. She glanced around, feeling a growing unease settle in her stomach. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the silence. No answer. She waited a moment, drumming her fingers on the counter, her eyes scanning the shelves filled with dusty, forgotten products. As the seconds ticked by, she heard something. A soft, shuffling sound coming from the back of the store. It was faint, like footsteps dragging across the floor. Lisa leaned forward, peering into the dark hallway that led to the storage area, but she couldn't see anyone. "Hello?" She tried again, her voice more uncertain this time. Still nothing. Just that faint, shuffling sound. Growing impatient, she decided to take a closer look. She walked around the counter and toward the back room where the noise was coming from. The deeper she went into the store, the colder the air became, as if a draft was seeping in through unseen cracks in the walls. The shuffling sound stopped abruptly as she reached the door to the storage area. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. She hesitated. Something felt wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She told herself it was just an old building, probably with creaky floors or animals scurrying in the walls. Mustering her courage, she slowly opened the door. The storage room was dimly lit, the single bulb overhead flickering like it was struggling to stay alive. The shelves were lined with boxes of supplies, dusty and disorganized, but there was no sign of anyone back there. The room was empty, eerily still. Just as Lisa was about to turn around and head back to the front, she heard a soft whisper. "Help. Me." Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there. Someone was whispering. "Is someone back here?" she called out, her voice shaking now. She took a step forward, straining her ears to listen. "Help me." The voice whispered again, a bit louder this time. Lisa's skin prickled with fear. The voice sounded distant, almost hollow, but it was close, too close. It seemed to be coming from behind one of the shelves. She slowly moved toward the sound, her palms slick with sweat as her heart pounded in her chest. As she reached the corner of the room, she saw it. Tucked between two shelves behind a stack of old boxes was a door. It was small and wooden, almost hidden in the shadows, as if it didn't belong there. The door looked ancient. The wood splintered and worn. There was no handle, just a small keyhole, but the door was slightly ajar, enough for her to see a sliver of darkness beyond it. "Help me," the voice whispered again from the other side of the door. Lisa's stomach twisted in fear. Everything inside her screamed to leave, to run and never come back, but something about the voice tugged at her. What if someone was trapped down there? What if they were hurt? Against her better judgment, she knelt down and pulled the door open wider. A narrow staircase descended into complete darkness. The air that wafted up from below was damp and cold, carrying with it a sickly, sweet smell. The whispering stopped. Lisa's breathing became shallow as she stared down into the black abyss. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, using the flashlight to shine down the stairs. The beam of light barely penetrated the thick darkness below, but she could see the edges of crumbling stone walls, slick with moisture. The staircase seemed to spiral downward, disappearing into the shadows. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible now. The silence that followed was suffocating, but then something moved. It was subtle at first, just a faint shift in the shadows, but as she squinted, she saw it clearly. A figure, tall and thin, almost skeletal, was standing at the bottom of the stairs. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but she could see its long arms hanging at its sides, the fingers unnaturally long and gnarled. It wasn't moving, just standing there, as if waiting for her. Lisa gasped, stumbling backward in terror. Her phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the ground. The flashlight flickered wildly as it spun across the floor, casting erratic beams of light around the room. Suddenly, the whispering started again, but this time, it wasn't a plea for help, it was laughter. Low, rasping, and unnatural. The sound of it filled the room, echoing off the walls growing louder with each passing second. Lisa scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She grabbed her phone and ran out of the storage room, slamming the door behind her. The laughter followed her, growing more distorted, more inhuman as she raced toward the front of the store. She burst through the front doors, nearly tripping over the threshold as she stumbled into the cold night air. Her lungs burned as she gasped for breath. the echo of that terrible laughter still ringing in her ears. She didn't look back. She jumped into her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys, and peeled out of the parking lot, speeding down the empty road. Later that night, when Lisa finally calmed down enough to check her phone, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On the screen, in the last photo her phone had taken as it fell, was a blurred image of the dark stairwell. But in the corner of the photo, standing just at the edge of the light, was the figure. And it was smiling.